Hello, everyone. Welcome to a super special edition of the eDiscovery channel, as if our trifecta on uh, Purview wasn't enough a couple of weeks ago. We've decided to really go down the rabbit hole and talk about hyperlink attachments. Not that anybody else has been talking about it because it's such a,
No.
yeah. And to really help us out here, we're extremely pleased to be joined by John Collins. And John, you are, and tell me if I get this right, Executive Director and Microsoft 365 Practice Lead / Information Governance at Lighthouse.
Yep.
Lighthouse
You got
Global,
it.
uh, uh, headquartered in Seattle. Um, I was actually living and working in Seattle many years ago when Josh and
Josh
uh,
Stellick.
yeah, Josh Stellick and forget his. There was another young guy named John Monroe. Uh,
Okay. John, I
they
know.
were working. They were working in the area for somebody else in Seattle, and decided to start off on their own and have done extremely well for themselves. Well, I think John's moved on. Um, John moved back out to, I want to say, Spokane. I don't know. You get over the mountains in Seattle, and it's all Idaho to me. It's if not Montana. Once you get once you get out there in the wheat fields. So, but uh, but John, why don't you just briefly, before we get into the hyperlink, maybe tell
Sure.
everybody a little bit about yourself and your background, just so we know what you know. We know who we're talking to here.
Yeah, absolutely. So, first part of my career, I was actually in sales, and that led me into working for West Publishing. And
Ah,
in working for West Publishing, I decided, hey, I really like working with lawyers, but I'd like to be a little more conversant with what they do. So I decided to go to law school. At the
ah,
time, living in Rochester, New York, there was no law school. So a new school had just started up in California called Concord Law School, and you
sure.
could earn your JD online.
Yep,
Well, I had no interest in being a lawyer. I just wanted to get a JD and be able to work with my customers and all of that. No, I mean, this is 1998, so pretty early on, and I went through the program, earned what they call an executive juris doctorate, which means I wasn't eligible to sit for the bar, even though I had gone through the same coursework because I completed it in a longer period of time. But I did that while working mostly for West Publishing full time. And that was really my entree into law.
great.
I was able to get a job as a technology consultant with them, moved from sales. And that's really what led me to doing the work that I do today. And I started working with networking systems and Windows NT and that type of thing. So I kind of became an IT expert. And then in 2004, 2005, got recruited to go work for an eDiscovery company. And really at that point, I really started doing data mapping and reverse engineering Exchange 2003, SharePoint 2003, SAP, Lotus Notes. And through that
Ooh,
reverse engineering, really
Lotus
became
Notes.
familiar
Ooh,
with the architecture of how these systems work.
Lotus Notes sent a shiver up my spine.
Yeah, talk about a rabbit hole. That was
Oh,
a real rabbit hole.
God.
Uh, but then about 8 years ago, a number of my customers, companies I was talking to said, "Hey, we're thinking about moving to the cloud, and we're kicking the tires on Office 365." And so I would say around 2016, 2017, it almost pivoted, like it seems like overnight. Every single company I was working with no longer was Exchange 2010 or 13. It was Office 365, Office 365. And
Yep,
since then, just been buried in just helping companies operationalize eDiscovery records management in that platform.
sure. Great, great. Um, so Rochester, that brings back some memories. I'm a New England guy. My my late wife was actually born in Rome.
Yeah,
Her
Rome,
dad,
New York. Yep.
yeah, her dad was in Air Force intelligence before he migrated
Yep.
to the CIA.
The
But
big Air Force base up in Rome.
exactly, he was stationed up there for a few
Yep.
years, uh, and I had cousins. Some of my close cousins, my mother's family were. My uncle was a something at at GE in Schenectady.
Yep.
So
Yep.
spent a lot of time in upstate New York. Uh, so that's great. So um, you've been working then from that description with M365, Microsoft 365, and what is now called Purview for a while. I would take it.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, the bones of what is Purview really started to emerge in Exchange on-prem 2010 and SharePoint 2010. And so there's still vestiges of that in Purview, but really, I mean, the Purview as we know it today, right, really came into being in 2019. That's when
The,
2020, that's
the old
when they,
security console, right?
right.
Wasn't
Yep.
even called Purview then yet. Yeah.
Yep.
So that's what Doug and I were just talking about. And Microsoft hasn't again been, it's not like they're not talking about it, but it would be nice if they had laid out, or if they would lay out a roadmap for people to say, here's how it started and here's what we did. And, you know, this isn't something we just made up a year and a half ago. Um,
Right.
we've been, and that's just somewhat disconcerting that they don't do that. You mentioned Greg Buckles. I had said to Doug, if it weren't for Greg's roadmap every month about what's going on, I don't think I would know what's going on. So,
Right. Yeah, he's excellent. And he's someone that I would recommend people follow because he clearly gets into the technology,
yeah,
reads the documentation, probably has multiple test tenants and really has a good grasp. So he's definitely someone to follow. Unlike others out there that there's a lot of misinformation, wrong information, inaccurate that's also espoused. But Greg, in my experience, is someone that's accurate and does know what he's talking about.
yeah, he
Yeah,
takes the time to
he does.
really go
Yeah,
ahead, Doug.
he does stay on top of it, and that's
Yep.
yeah, absolutely. That's one of
Yeah,
the things that's great. He does. Yeah, you talk about a roadmap, Tom. They do provide a micro level roadmap. What we need is something that's a little more macro level that can kind of say here it is, because there's so many changes they're making in each month's micro level roadmap that it's
right.
even if you do have the information, it's still kind of hard to really understand the significance of it
Yeah.
all.
Yep.
And Greg made the point that I was not aware of either, but Microsoft takes that down every 4 or 5 weeks. You can't go back and say what was the roadmap in January of this year. It's gone. There's the most recent roadmap, and unless you've bothered to download that or save it or print it or something, um,
Right.
good
That's what
luck.
I would recommend people do if they're interested, because you can download it as a
Yeah,
CSV. And
yeah,
then that's what we actually do that with the documentation. We periodically take snapshots of it so that we can compare a year ago to today. What did Microsoft say about a particular topic a year ago? And sometimes it evolves and changes on the
yeah,
exact point.
yeah, and yeah. I'm not in any way trying to insinuate that they're doing something nefarious. That
No.
things change, and and that's
Yep.
part of the problem. It's such a huge ecosystem and changes dynamically, organically on if not a daily, certainly a weekly basis. But yeah, it's hard to keep up with. It's probably hard for them to keep up with what's going on.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing. Like when you talk to a Microsoft person that's in the eDiscovery product engineering or marketing team, the thing that I've realized is that they don't know what's going on in every part of Microsoft. Therefore, they don't know exactly what's going on with all of the eDiscovery implications and changes that might come in, because there might be a change in SharePoint that's being made on storage that they're just not conversant with it, right?
Yep.
And there's no one person that has complete knowledge of everything about
Across
M365.
all of those, yeah.
Right.
Just isn't.
That became clear to me at that Microsoft breakfast at
Yep.
Legal Week, that that there was not that there were separate buckets for things like SharePoint and Teams,
Right.
and so if you're talking to their M365 people, great, you get a wealth of information, but it may not extend to how other buckets are going to get filled and bleed over,
Yep.
and what new bucket might be coming down the road to dump the other buckets into. So yeah, so all that being said, now that we've scared the hell out of everybody by saying how difficult this is and crazy to follow, um, talk to us about hyperlink attachments. I
Sure.
mean, the extent of my knowledge is that um, Microsoft has made available in Purview with an E5 license the ability to grab a hyperlink attachment and subsequent revisions, not backwards revisions, as Doug has pointed out. The day that you decide to grab it is great. If there was anything before that, you're not getting it. You're only moving forward. But that it, and this is where I've had conflicting stories.
Sure.
I've been told that you have to have an E5 license. I've also been told an E3 license will grab the current version of a
Okay.
hyperlink
Yeah.
on the date that you put the hold in place. I've
Right.
also been told that that's not true.
Right.
So I don't know which is true, and if you have any elucidation there. Doug also came up with, and I'm not sure, did this come from you, John? The kind of the workaround to save yourself a little money on the E5 and grab that.
That was yeah, I covered that based on the discussion I had with John a few weeks ago. So
Right.
because that's one of the things, of course, is E5 doesn't necessarily mean full E5 as I understand it, John, but I'll let you get into that.
Yeah.
But certainly a question I also have as a part of all of this is I think there's been some confusion just exactly how long that cloud collection capability has been there, and especially in terms of the ability to go grab the different versions of the files as well. Because one of the things, of course, that is my understanding is that you basically you had to once you started using the capability and you had to tag the files or label the files or what have you, that's when the ability to go get those previous versions began, but not before. So if it was a fairly new capability, you didn't have the ability to go back and grab that stuff. But now I'm hearing that it could be as much as 2 to 3 years old, that capability. So definitely interested in that as well, to clarify that.
Sure. Yeah. So I think so the way that I like to explain this and talk about this, and I think I'll hit on all the points that you guys brought up, is first off, regardless of your license level, you could be the lowest license level, which is a business basic. You could be business premium. You could be E3, E5. There's E1. There's a whole host of government and education tenants, right? All of them in the normal course of business have the ability for hyperlinks, right? So if you're using Teams, if you're using email, you always have the option to insert a link. What Microsoft, the terminology they used a couple years ago was modern attachments. Now, most of the time it's referred to as cloud attachment, but everyone has the ability to insert a hyperlink. And in the normal course of business, everyone can invoke that link if they're in a chat, in an email, and if the file's still there, it'll pull up the file, right? So that has nothing to do with your licensing level. So then what comes in is, okay, now I need to collect emails and I need to collect chats, right? And everyone, I think, knows that emails, you have the option to either have a physical attachment or a hyperlink, right? And there's settings where you can default to always a hyperlink, or in most instances a hyperlink. But in Teams, there is no option. It's, if you're going to share a file, it will be a hyperlink. That is a stone cold fact. And so when you're looking at through the eDiscovery lens, right? If you have a premium license, an E5 level license, and as Tom and you alluded to, there's multiple flavors of E5 licensing, then you have the right, license-wise, to collect cloud attachments. Now, this has been around for about 2 years, okay? About a year ago, it's a little bit more than a year ago, and I might be getting dates off a little bit here. So the ability to collect cloud attachments has been around for 2 years, at least. About a year and a half ago, Microsoft introduced the ability to collect the exact version of a file that is shared. Now, the way that actually is operationalized is that Microsoft does some back-end process. Basically, if you turn this on, what happens is in your tenant, every single item that's shared as a hyperlink in an email or in a cloud attachment gets a copy of that file at the moment that it's shared is put into a specific storage location that end users don't have access to. And so that's what we refer to that as an auto-apply label policy, right? So it's technically not even an eDiscovery feature to enable this. It's technically a records management feature.
It's an IG
Now,
issue, right? Yeah.
yeah. So, but you do need to have that licensing, that higher level licensing to enable this. Now, so basically what happens is that you have so basically what you have is you need the E5 license or flavor of it in order to collect cloud attachments, right? So that's the baseline.
Now let me interject just real quickly there, John. Is that only applicable to M365 cloud attachments? So what if I have a document that's in, and I'm just using them as an example, net documents in their cloud, for example, something that's outside of the M365 universe, will it still go get them?
No, it's strictly, it actually uses the same path
right
that an end user uses to collect the cloud attachment. So it's actually using the same, the same link. So if it's in net documents, if it's in Box, Dropbox, it's not going to collect it.
And you see, the problem that arises here is if you're using Teams with people outside of the environment, like a client, and the client sends a link and
right. Yeah. Share from a different source. Yeah, it's not automatically collected. And one of the things I want to make sure I clarify is without the E5 license, does that mean you're not saving the versions to be collected? Or how does that work?
Yeah, so let's talk about this. So with the premium licensing, you now have the ability to collect M365 cloud attachments in your tenant, right? Now, by default, what happens is it collects the most recent version, right? Now, the most recent version might be the version that was shared.
Sure.
None of us on this call could possibly know in a tenant whether that's going to happen or not. It's just not going to be possible, right? We're talking about in any size organization, hundreds of thousands, probably millions of files. So none of us are going to know that. But it's the most recent version is what it collects. Right. Now, you also have the ability to collect every version. You can collect every version. So basically, you can collect the most recent version, and you can collect all 300 or 20 or 50, whatever the case is, versions. And there's a good chance that one of those versions is the one that's shared. But if you do that, there's nothing in M365 that will identify the exact version that was shared at this point, right? Because remember, I haven't brought in that auto label policy, which I'm going to talk about in a second.
Okay.
Is the collecting all versions another label? Does it do that automatically? You have to tell it to do it?
So there's in eDiscovery Premium, there's a point at which you can tell the system, I want all versions. So basically you check a box. Now, as you guys have pointed out today and in other podcasts, M365 is changing like every second. So there's a new user interface that is being rolled out, and they actually give you the ability to check a box that says, I want just the last I want 5 versions, I want 10, I want 20, or I want all. So they're making it a little bit easier to basically control how many versions. But as it stands today, the default has been you check a box and you're going to get every single version that's there.
So you right now today don't have the ability to say, I want the specific version that was sent at the time.
Well, so remember what I'm saying is that with the premium licensing, without enabling this auto apply policy, you have the ability to collect the most recent version.
Right.
Or you can check a box and it'll collect every version.
Oh.
And you'll get them. So if you've got a chat that's got a Word document that's got 15 versions, and one of them is a version that was shared a year ago, you're going to get the version that was edited yesterday. That's going to be the current version. And then you'll get the other 14 versions, one of which was the one that was shared a year ago.
Got
So
it. Right.
now, about a year ago, I think it's actually more like maybe 18 months, Microsoft added a new feature, which is called the version shared auto apply policy. It's a new feature. If you enable that in your tenant, then what will happen is every time a user shares a hyperlink in email or chat, Microsoft will take a copy of that file, it'll put it in a hidden folder in SharePoint or OneDrive, and it makes it available for discovery later. So you have to enable that feature. You need to enable it up against all the locations in your tenant that you want this feature to be available. So for the clients that we work with, for the most part, if they're going to enable it, and not everybody does, there's a lot of discussion back and forth. Should we, shouldn't we? Should we buy the license to do this? But generally speaking, the people that are doing it, they're enabling it everywhere.
And when you say you have to do that, are we talking an admin function now? The
Yes.
user is not doing that. Yeah.
Yeah. Yep. And again, it's technically a records management feature that
Right.
you're enabling. So, but then to Tom, Tom brought this up before, and you guys have talked about this. So the way that feature works is if you enable this policy, you now have added the ability to collect the version that was shared. However, as you guys have pointed out, that only works on a go forward basis. So if I enable it today, that means that the versions shared from today forward are being captured and stored. But again, remember, you can still collect from 2 years ago, 5 years ago, whatever, right? But you're not going to, this version shared isn't going to impact those old files. But you could still you could still collect every single version.
Go and get that user's email and get them. Yeah. Does the user know that that's happening when that feature is turned on?
No, the user's unaware. There used to be a backdoor in OneDrive where someone could go find their preservation hold library, which is what this is called, where they store it. Microsoft's actually obfuscating the URL now. So, but you can still kind of backdoor it to figure it out. But so basically there's a folder that says version shared, and you see all these funny looking files with weird GUIDs in front of them. But basically the user can't delete it. They can't do anything with it.
Gotcha. Yeah. So
that's all real clear. That'll be easy to do, right?
Sorry, it's the sausage making is
right. The ultimate sausage making. Yeah.
So when they do that on a go forward basis, then they could choose to collect the specific version that was sent, and only that version.
So now the way that it works is that when you've enabled the version shared, when you get to the point where it asks you, do you want all versions? If you don't check that, then what you're going to get is you're going to get the most current version, and you're going to get the version that was shared.
Okay, got it.
So that's the way they architected. So you get here's the current version, and then if it was a year ago that the file was shared, that's what you're going to get.
Okay. So last week we did a webinar on modern attachments.
Which I listened to. Yep.
Okay, great.
Hey, I'm sorry. Can I just make sure I understand that? So in that case, it will go backwards.
Correct.
If you do that,
no.
Yeah, go ahead, Doug.
Well, you're saying it will only go backwards if you've enabled the version share. It will only go backwards to the version share for that. It's not going to go backwards before you started setting up the version share, right?
Correct. Right. So version shared forward is where the version shared feature is effective. Backward looking, you can collect every version, and
right.
As long as that file's still there, you will get it, but you won't have that, because in Microsoft's parlance, they call it a review set, when you're in the review set, which is where the metadata appears that tells you that it's the version that was shared, right? That's only gonna appear, in the file, from that point at which you enable the version shared, right? So
Gotcha. Gotcha.
so that's where the confusion is. It's like you could collect the version that was shared from 5 years ago. You're just gonna have to figure out
Right.
which is the version shared. Does it still exist? Number one, and number
If
two,
it
if
still
it does,
exists. Yeah.
you have to correlate it, with the actual date of the chat or the email, and that's the challenge there.
Sure.
Yep.
That makes sense.
Great.
So,
Thanks.
on the webinar, one of the attendees asked a question because we were talking about some of the technical challenges and so forth, and she said, when there's a need to collect all versions of hyperlinked files from Purview, the export nearly always fails or is throttled and takes data export. Versioning tends to make the data set really big. Imagine so. So, any strategies to cope with this? So what do you have to say to that, both from a version share standpoint, and if they haven't enabled that, is there anything they can do?
So that's a good point, and that is in and of itself a whole rabbit hole and a whole conversation. Microsoft has architected eDiscovery Premium so that in the ideal world, what you do is you go into your tenant, you have 10 custodians, 100 custodians, 1,000 custodians, whatever. You would use keywords and conditions to filter at the point of collection the data that you're going to export out. So Microsoft has architected the system so that their theory is that you're going to cull at the point of collection. And so if you have 100 people at a big company, small company, doesn't matter, every mailbox basically in a premium license, E3, E5, business premium, gets a 1.5 terabyte mailbox, right? So basically everyone has the capacity for an enormous amount of email that can be stored. So Microsoft, their philosophy is, well, don't collect everything in these people's mailboxes, collect just what you need to push forward. In fact, EJ Bastian, who many of you, I think you guys both know from Microsoft, who runs their eDiscovery program, is very vocal in the community about they use this process for many of their cases. So, but having said that, if you're not going to use keywords, our recommendation is, number one, do category specific collections, right? So do email as a collection, do Teams as a collection. That will help you reduce the amount of data. Always use a date range if you can. And if you can, use some objective filtering criteria, like don't bring in like ESPN.com emails and that type of thing. So do things like that at the point of collection. But having said that, the person is absolutely right. If you check that box for files, right, for every version, you are going to explode the volume of data that gets collected. And in my experience, we have collections that can be half a terabyte. I mean, we've got very large collections that work, but we also do see failures. And so the recommendations we make are the techniques that I'm talking about. Chop up your collections into smaller increments, do category-based collections to begin with, export out your Teams data as one export out your email as another data set. We're big fans of when you export Teams data and an email data, you do that separately from OneDrive and SharePoint. So basically you're doing an export that's going to give you cloud attachments, right? And you will get a lot, again, if you check the versions.
Right.
But those are different techniques and strategies to keep the volume of the data down. But if you just go into a tenant, collect the mailboxes of 25 custodians, that could be 5 terabytes worth of data. That is going to cause potential problems.
Sure, makes sense. So some of the things that I hear from people, some people I think are not very complimentary about Microsoft's eDiscovery filtering and searching capabilities,
Yep.
and tend to go the route of the whole custodian collection as a result. Anything you have to say to that? Any kind of anomalies or things to watch out for? Because it sounds like you're a proponent of doing the filtering in Microsoft's eDiscovery module and moving forward a cold collection, whereas others are saying, no, it's not good enough. You need to do it. You do your culling downstream. Thoughts about that?
Yes, I think that Microsoft Purview is an eDiscovery tool, just like Nuix, just like Intella, just like Relativity is a tool. Is it as good? Is it as robust? Does it do everything those tools do? No, it doesn't. It's not. Microsoft is not looking to build the best of breed eDiscovery tool. That is not their objective, right? So let's just get that out of the way. However, I think you guys would agree. I'd be curious what your opinions are. Perfection isn't the standard. Being the best at eDiscovery for a Fortune 1000 company is like, I don't know how much shareholder value or customer value that brings to the table. So the key question is, does the person and persons using the tool know how it works, know what its limitations are, know what it can do, what it can't do, and are they using it in a way so that that is transparent, that it's completely known what is and isn't being done? And if that's the case, I absolutely 100% believe that you can use Purview to execute your eDiscovery obligations, right? Because at the end of the day, the indexing, the error handling, and all of that is there, right? If something's not indexed, there's an error remediation process. There's a massive amount of misinformation out there about how the indexing works. There's actually in eDiscovery Premium, there's 4 different indexes, right? And depending on what you're looking to achieve and which index you're leveraging, that impacts, right, what the output is that you're producing. I don't believe that Microsoft is interested in replacing Relativity. I think Microsoft is the one thing that Purview is not is a full-blown review tool, right? There's no production capabilities whatsoever. There's no Bates stamping.
Right.
The reaction capability is extremely limited.
And
I
they
don't
say
see
that,
any.
in their defense, they're very
Right.
clear about
Sure.
that.
Yep.
We're not trying to replace that. Yeah.
Yeah, they're not trying to replace it. But are you going to tell me that that all you can do is take a date range across 100 mailboxes and cull it from 10 terabytes to 5 terabytes and not do anything else in M365? No way. There are companies out there. Microsoft, of course, is the most prominent example, but there are companies out there that are using keywords, that are using domain filtering, that are using subject and title filtering, the things that you can do outside of M365 in M365, but they have the expertise, they do the testing, right? They know what's going on, they have an error and processing remediation process, and they're able to say, this is what did or didn't happen. We work with clients all the time that are either doing that or moving to that model. And that's really, I think, the most important thing is that if you don't know what's going on under the hood and you're using it, you're definitely playing with fire.
Yeah, agreed. So you talked about limitations, and everybody talks about the collection side, but a few weeks ago, you and I talked about also the preservation considerations as well.
Yep.
And I wrote a blog post about it after we had that discussion. So talk about that and what exactly is being preserved when you preserve a custodian and what is not being preserved.
Okay. I know you were talking with Greg about this and Greg Buckles and the storage and that type of thing.
Right.
So I think there's kind of the physical, technical, how things are stored in M365, which is important and interesting, but there's still the logical construct of a custodian, which Microsoft still has a pretty strong adherence to. So basically, when you go into eDiscovery Premium, you add a custodian, and by default, it adds the custodian's Exchange mailbox, and it adds their OneDrive. Now, by virtue of adding those 2 things, you're adding a broad swath of different categories of content to the preservation. So for Exchange, let's take that first. That means when you preserve the custodian, you're preserving all of their email. You're preserving all of their one-to-one and group chats, in Teams chats. You're preserving any Yammer or Viva conversation, individual messages, right? You're also preserving what are called private channel conversations. Now, Microsoft's supposed to be moving that to the non-custodial, but currently in our testing, we're still seeing the private channel conversation. So and then on top of that, there's other content like meeting summaries for Teams, call detail records that you're also preserving. So there's a host of these sort of second tier artifacts that might be of interest in any given matter that you're also preserving. So on the Exchange side, that's what you're preserving. On the OneDrive side, you're preserving any files that user has proactively or affirmatively stored in their OneDrive, right? So if I create a Word document, I store it in my OneDrive, you're collecting that. But there's also a growing list of about 10 folders that are system-generated folders where when a user interacts throughout Microsoft 365, content that gets generated is being dropped into those different folders. So one of the things that I think Greg Buckles was talking about was loop components, right?
Right.
So in certain contexts, if you create a loop component, it gets dropped into that OneDrive folder. If you guys had set this meeting up as a Teams meeting, and let's say, Tom, you were the organizer of the Teams meeting and you were recording this, there's a folder that says recordings in your OneDrive where the recording the MP4 gets dropped into there. There's certain contexts where if you share a file in a Teams chat or an email, it gets dropped into another folder. So OneDrive is also very broad preservation of a wide range of content, some of which the user is proactively putting in there, and some of which Microsoft is putting in there as part of their architecture for how they wanted to, make the data available and also make it subject to eDiscovery, because they do care about that, right? They do want to make content subject to eDiscovery, even though that's not necessarily the number one thing that they're trying to do.
Sure. But let's say we have a custodian and you preserve her Exchange and you preserve her OneDrive and you preserve all those things.
Yep.
I'm not a custodian. I send a hyperlink to her in an email of a file I have in my OneDrive.
Yep.
If I'm not a custodian, is that part of the preservation?
No, that's a great point. And that's one of the things when we work with clients that if you're hell-bent on, I need to preserve every single file that Doug Austin had access to, then you would, in theory, have to do one of two things. You would have to, and this is where it gets complicated. You would have to preserve that individual, right, that shared the files, OneDrive, but here's the misnomer. When you share a file in Teams or email, it doesn't always, there's not, like I could share a file with you, Doug, in a one-to-one chat, but that file might live in a SharePoint site. It might live in a collaboration team, a channel. And
Sure.
So in theory, if I said, I want to make sure any files that someone might have shared with Doug are preserved, I would either have to preserve, I mean, if I knew which locations, great. But again, nobody's going to know that.
Right.
You would have to research that and it's not going to happen. So you would have to preserve every place in your Microsoft tenant, every SharePoint site, every team, on the off chance that somebody shared a file from that location. Or something that we bring up to clients, people don't like it, and especially defense counsel don't like this. Well, you could collect to preserve.
Right.
You could collect into a review set. Microsoft's not going to charge you hosting fees. So just collect it and it'll grab it from whoever shared it with you's location. Now, then you have the whole version shared issue and thing that you have to deal with, but.
Sure. Well, and that's one of the things to me is kind of ironic about this is because of the way the data is organized. Some companies, if they do want to preserve fully to that level, they're defeating the whole in-place preservation by actually doing that collect to preserve that we've tried to avoid, that we've had over the years. That used to be, kind of the approach of collect the custodian corpus, move it downstream, sort it out later. Now they're kind of almost having to do that just to make sure it's preserved.
Yep. Yeah. So fun. And then
Well,
you do have
and
the option to preserve all the other non-custodial locations in M365. So, but again, that's you would have to know what locations to target in order to do that in the scenario we just talked about.
so
Can I just bring up one more thing, Tom?
go right ahead. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
So, and obviously then when you are, one of the things, of course, we're doing in email, but especially in Teams, is collaborating with people in other organizations. So conceivably, they share a file from their organization. You don't have access to the file in your tenant. That's probably going to mean that people are going to have to do more, basically file more non-party subpoenas to get the other side of those files, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's not going to collect it, so it's not going to be able to grab it. But you do get into situations where there's shared Teams channels. You can give people, you can make them guest users in your tenant. So there's a lot of different edge cases and things that where a guest might actually be creating a document, someone that works for another company, but it is stored in that. I mean, there's a lot of different permutations of that. But if it's what you described, which is they're sharing from another tenant, there's no cross-tenant collection.
I mean, I would see that come up a lot with the client and his inside counsel. You've got outside counsel in one tenant, and you've got the client and inside counsel, and all that's going on, and they're sharing documents back and forth, but they're separate tenants.
Yep.
Yeah. So let me just bring back something I mentioned slightly earlier, though. Where does this leave the DMS companies in that whole scenario you just described? Aren't they getting kind of whipsawed here?
Well, you're talking about like Net Documents and iManage.
Yeah. What if the company is not saving to OneDrive, excuse me, or whatever? They're saving to a DMS, which has its own web-based storage area.
Right.
Then what?
Well, I think it in my experience, where you really see iManage and Net Documents is in the corporate world, is in the legal department.
Right.
So it's pretty rare that I've seen those DMSs, outside the legal department. Law firms, it's the opposite, right? That's like their bread and butter of how they manage documents. So I think in the corporate world, where I could see it coming in is that you've got people that are inserting hyperlinks into emails, and then you can insert hyperlinks from iManage. You could navigate, if you can navigate to iManage through the dialogue in Teams or email, then you could insert a hyperlink to an iManage document or a Net Documents or something like that. But again, Microsoft's not going to collect it. My view on that is that if a company needs a real document management system that's tailored to the legal process, that's not Teams, that's not SharePoint, that's Net Documents or iManage or one of those guys. So, but it does introduce, another area that hyperlinks can be introduced into the environment.
So, but you just made an interesting point that you see it at a corporation, mostly in the legal department. So if Boeing is sending around, which they do, an assembly manual to put together the wing structure of the new 747, how are they saving that? They're using their own system? Are they, and then they have to give that to the legal department and when litigation comes up. They're not using a DMS. They're using a homegrown DMS. They're extracting
now my experience. I mean, that's so my experience going back to my data mapping days. And I never worked with Boeing, so I can't say.
No, I
but other
pulled that name out of a hat.
Yeah, other companies, in my experience, what often happens is they'll have specialty document management systems, like there's engineering systems that
Right.
Windchill and others, where those systems actually have their own document management framework, right? And so from what I remember when I was doing that type of work is you go into a company like Boeing, an engineering company, and they have a document management system, and they're sharing documents back and forth and keeping track of versions and updates and superseded versions and all of that. And they're doing that in that very specific system. And most of those all had hyperlinks as one of the foundational ways that you collaborated, right? You had a copy that multiple people could access. So
Right.
I think what's happened with M365 is that companies revisit, do we really need all these different systems that manage documents? And usually what will happen in my experience is they'll look at what's unique to Windchill, what's unique to NetDocuments, and does that unique functionality warrant the extra expense versus just having SharePoint or Teams. There's also a company I don't know if you guys have heard of called Epona, E-P-O-N-A, that sits on top of M365 and Teams and has the legal-friendly interface for managing documents. So, and it's a lot, I think it's less expensive than a full, like the other systems. In any event, that's kind of my 2 cents on that one.
So then when the documents need to be extracted, if you will, they give them to the legal department who puts them into their system, puts them into.
Yeah, my experience then then that's like a lot of the data mapping work that I used to do was, okay, we have identified that you have Windchill, right, or AutoCAD or whatever that you're managing documents in. Does it have a native eDiscovery functionality? And most of them didn't. And so what you would say to them is, okay, do you want to collect to preserve the data? Yes or no? People can edit the document if you don't collect it. Are you comfortable? So you have that conversation. And then sometimes you do collect to preserve. And so in my experience, then you would get into, okay, if it's CAD drawings, you collect them as CAD drawings, then you're not going to put those into relativity. You'd have, some kind of viewer. But then the other documents like PDFs and things like that, you would collect those and then put those into your collection and process them in Nuix and whatever your downstream process is. But if they're in Microsoft, and if it's a PDF, obviously it becomes subject to the built-in eDiscovery tools.
Yeah. So you said something, you said it several times here now, though, that I think is really the key. Greg brought this up too, which is you need to have a data management strategy.
Yep.
Data mapping, for lack of a better phrase. I was involved in a case years ago, and it predates all of this technology with Caesar's Palace, and each of the casinos around the country was actually a separate fiefdom that had its own system. And I asked for a data map from them, and by the time the litigation ended, 3 years after I came on board, I still didn't have one.
Right.
They didn't have a data strategy, which is really going to defeat everything that we're talking about. Yeah.
Right.
So you're right.
That decentralized was a challenge when I would go into a company and they'd say, well, each unit or business unit or plant has its own systems. That was like, this is going to be a lot of work, right? But M365 has, the thing about M365 is that at the end of the day, if you're using it, I know what your architecture is, right? I don't know what you've enabled necessarily, but I have
but I got a
much
framework.
Less of a black box than it was before.
I can put a fence around that, and we can try to herd if not the ponies, the cats, right?
Sure. One other quick scenario I'll throw out, because we've actually seen it in the case, is a kind of a hybrid solution of Exchange pointing to Google files, because the StubHub case, that was one of the challenges there. It wasn't a case where they were all in one or the other. They were email in Microsoft files, linked files in Google. So obviously no automation there between the two products, and that was part of the challenge in that case. So I'm sure those are instances out there. And again, another reason why it's good to have a data strategy, kind of program for how you manage your data effectively.
Well, and to that effect, I mean, in the Noom case, in the Uber case, Judge Cisneros said it. You know, I'm not going to talk about any sort of sanctions. The party is using Google Vault. There's no ability to do what we're talking about in Google Vault, and there's no other technology out there that can do it. And that's what's been driving my discussion in all this is, yeah, there is.
Right.
You know,
Right.
and I'm pretty sure she said, I'm paraphrasing here now. So, Judge, please, if you hear this or somebody reports it to you, I'm using my old man's brain now. But I thought she said something like to the effect of, I would have a different view on this if there were technology that could do this sort of thing. And my response to that is, well, there is. You know,
Right.
if you chose to use the one that doesn't do it, then, well, I mean, shouldn't you be held to a little different standard? Now, granted, I don't know when that case was briefed, when the fact patterns came up, what they had in place. You know, the decision was in April of this year. You know, the facts probably go back a year. The systems go back maybe longer than that. So, but the point is, there is technology that can help you get a handle on this. And so I had said at the beginning to you, John, I know you know, the folks at Lighthouse are trying to work on something that will make that happen in Google.
Yep.
I think we're going to see it. I've said this in several of our other sessions. I think we're going to see that. We're going to
Yep.
see something by next year.
Right.
You know, you have to. You know, maybe Google itself isn't going to come up with it. They're going to be kind of like what you said with Microsoft. We're going to leave this to our channel partners to do, but somebody's going to come up with something.
Well, but a question to that, because obviously what Microsoft is now doing is it's providing a mechanism to preserve that sent file, that contemporaneous file. Google,
Yep.
to my knowledge, isn't doing that yet.
No, no.
So when we say there's technology that exists, it only can go so far. And to me, I don't think anybody else is going to be able to develop something unless they are on Google, basically capturing stuff from Google as it's happening, because there's no way they're going to get that version of the file that was sent. Then, of course, you get the debate about, well, you know, do you have to produce an alternate version if it isn't? And there's the whole big debate on each side of the V on that, and we don't have to get into all of that. But that's
Right.
definitely one of the things that you don't have from a Google standpoint is
Yeah.
you don't currently have the ability to get back to that actual version that was sent. Again, it may not, the current version may be the file that was sent. You just don't know.
You don't know.
But that's certainly a limitation that no outside platform's going to be able to solve, I don't think. I think it's going to have to be Google that fixes that.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think Google is not like in lockstep with Microsoft trying to match their features by any
No.
way, shape,
Right.
or form. So it's not like one would expect that they'll come out with something that's some kind of cadence after Microsoft does.
No,
So
I don't think Google will. I think other
Yeah.
people may try to emulate it to the best of
Right.
their ability. And
Yep.
and maybe, like you said, Doug, maybe it just can't be done. But you know, it's going to be interesting.
Not without Google help. The one thing that might change things is if enough companies are having to respond to government investigations or something like that, where
Right.
you really are not going to be in a very good position to tell the DOJ, sorry, we can't get you those files.
Yeah.
You know, it's a different kind
My
of
software
motivation.
doesn't do that. I'm sorry.
Right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right, exactly. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
not going to go over so well. So
No.
that may be the ultimate impetus that causes some change here.
Yeah.
We'll see.
Yeah. Well, John, I want to be mindful of time. You've been great sharing your time with us. Any other points you'd like to make? Anything you'd like to hit on before we wrap up here?
I think that just the theme that we already touched on, which is for folks out there that are interested in these topics and really care about these topics like we do, do your research, read the documentation, vet what people say. Don't take it at face value, because there have been a couple of prominent voices in the eDiscovery industry that have spread inaccurate information that's patently false. Like it's like almost a no-brainer, like certain things, like it does, M365 doesn't do Boolean searching. If you do a word search of a keyword search of the documentation, Boolean comes up like 150 times. So I just think be careful. M365 does have issues and challenges, and it is not a tool to be trifled with. If you're going to use it, You've got to have the right framework. You've got to test. You've got to have the right processes. Make sure that the black box that it can be is as transparent as possible. But if you go through those steps, and we always, like, what our team does is we say to people when they say they want to use M365 and they really want to make use of it, say, do you have the appetite? Like, you got to have an appetite. You got, like, this is not, like, you got to have an appetite. If you do,
Not for the faint of heart, right?
it's not, that's perfect. Exactly. It's not for the faint of heart. And I don't want to paint this picture like it's like this impossible hill. No, it's just that if you're using Nuix, if you're using relativity, if you're used to a nice, solid workflow, I get it. That's comfortable. Those tools are good. But if you have an E5 license already and you're pumping out terabytes of data a year, you're probably leaving hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars on the table.
Yep.
If you're not using, by not using the tools. And that may make you sleep better at night. And if that's the case, great. But don't, do your diligence and, find someone. There's a lot of consultants out there that know this space, reputable people that I know both of you guys know, and just, connect with them, have them help you with building out your processes.
Right. Great. Well, thanks again for your time. We've been speaking with John Collins of Lighthouse, who, as you can tell, knows a whole lot more about M365 than Doug and I do. and that's always the old story down here in Louisiana years ago when they were, back in the days after up until World War II, and shortly after, there didn't used to be a bar exam, a written bar exam. You went in and took an oral exam. You were interviewed by because there weren't that many people attempting to be lawyers, and I believe it was Huey Long, the well-renowned kingfish of Louisiana politics, had gone in to sit for the bar, and was asked a question about, what's the rule in Shelley's case, or what would you do with, some obscure area of law, and he said, well, I don't know. And the bar examiner, the member of the board, said, well, what would you do if you had a client come to you with a case like that, had a question like that? He said, I'd call you. Don't be afraid to ask the experts, because that's what they're that's the solution. Okay, John, thanks again.
Yes, thanks, John.
Really
thanks so
appreciate
much for
your time.
having me. I enjoyed it very much.
All right.
I got to finish up listening to the other podcasts that I started listening to. There's
right.
good stuff there.
Good deal. We'll see you again on the eDiscovery channel.